Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Shadow Man's Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Thomas Ashford, and I've been a ranger in the Monongahela National Forest for 16 years. In that time, I've pulled 847 people out of these mountains alive. Lost hikers, injured climbers, kids who wandered off from their families. I've found them all. Every single one. That's what I tell myself when I can't sleep at night. People think being a ranger is just hiking around and telling folks not to feed the bears. They don't know about the search and rescue training, the cave rescue certifications, the child psychology courses I took so I could talk scared kids down from ledges. They don't know about Korea either, about the things I learned there about staying alive when everything goes wrong. But mostly, they don't know about what happened in October of 1967, up on Devil's Backbone Ridge near the old Black Rock mine. I'm telling this story now because I need people to understand, when parents bring their kids camping in these mountains, when scout troops come through on their wilderness badges, they need to know what's really out there. Not the bears or the cliffs or the cold that'll kill you. Those are honest dangers. I'm talking about something else. Something that wears the faces of children but isn't children at all. It started on a Tuesday morning when I got the call about Troop 247. 12 boys, ages 8 to 14, camping with their scoutmaster near the ridge. They'd been due back at the ranger station Monday evening, but nobody showed up. When the scoutmaster's wife called Tuesday morning, she was already crying. "Tom, they were supposed to be home last night. Jimmy promised he'd call when they got back to town." I knew Jimmy Morrison, good man, careful with kids. Been taking scouts into these mountains for 10 years, without so much as a scraped knee. If Jimmy was late, something was wrong. The weather hadn't been helping. October in West Virginia can turn mean fast, and we'd had snow flurries the night before. Temperature was dropping toward freezing, and thick fog was rolling through the hollows like smoke. Perfect conditions for hypothermia if those boys were stuck somewhere without shelter. I grabbed my gear and radioed for the full search and rescue team. 8 of us total, with thermal imaging equipment, bloodhounds, and enough rope to reach the bottom of the mountain if we had to. We'd done this dance plenty of times before. But when we reached their last known campsite, everything felt wrong. The camp was still there, 12 sleeping bags laid out neat as you please around a fire that was still burning. Nobody packs up and leaves a fire going. The boys' backpacks were lined up in perfect order against a fallen log. Their hiking boots sat in pairs next to each sleeping bag, like they'd all decided to go barefoot at the same time. "Tom," called out Jake Peters, one of my best searchers. "Come look at this." He was crouched down near the edge of camp, studying the ground. Fresh footprints led away from the sleeping bags toward the tree line. Small prints, child-sized, but they were bare feet, pressed deep into the cold mud. "Kids don't go hiking barefoot when it's 30 degrees, Jake said. I knelt down beside him. The prints were clear as day, leading straight toward the old mining area. 12 sets of small, naked footprints heading into the woods like they were following something. "Maybe they heard something," I said, trying to make sense of it. Kids that age, they get curious. But even as I said it, I knew it didn't add up. Jimmy Morrison would never let his boys wander off into the night, especially not toward the mines. Every local knew those old shafts were death traps, rotted timber, hidden drops, bad air. The Black Rock mine had been sealed for decades after the cave-in back in the 1890 seconds. That's when Mrs. Patterson spoke up. She was the local store owner who'd driven up with us. Gray-haired and tough as mountain stone. "You know what happened at that mine, Tom?" "Cave-in in 1897, I said. 23 miners died. I know the history." "Not miners," she said, voice quiet. "Children. Working the mine like they did back then. 23 little ones. Youngest was 7 years old. They never got the bodies out." I'd heard the stories before. Local folklore about kids who died in the mines, about voices singing in the dark tunnels. Ghost stories. The kind of thing that keeps tourists coming and gives teenagers something to dare each other about. But standing there looking at those bare footprints leading toward Black Rock, I felt something cold crawl up my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. We followed the trail for 2 hours before the dogs started acting up. Rex and Belle were our best tracking hounds, trained to follow scent trails through anything. They'd never failed to lead us to a missing person. But as we got closer to the mine entrance, both dogs started whimpering and pulling back on their leads. "Come on, girl," Jake coaxed Belle, but she just sat down and refused to move. Rex was backing away, the hair on his neck standing straight up. The mine entrance was just ahead, a black hole in the mountainside, partially blocked by old timber and wire fencing. Someone had put up "Danger, keep out" signs years ago, but kids had been sneaking in there for decades anyway. I pulled out my radio to check in with base camp. Static crackled back at me, getting worse the closer we got to the mine. My GPS was acting up too, coordinates jumping around like we were moving even when we stood still. "Equipment's going screwy," I told the team. "Must be some kind of mineral deposit affecting the electronics." But I knew these mountains better than anyone, and I'd never had instrument problems like this before. That's when we found the first real evidence. Scattered around the mine entrance were pages from a Boy Scout handbook. But not new pages. These looked old, yellowed like they'd been sitting out in the weather for years instead of hours. The edges were brown and crumbling, and when I picked one up, it felt brittle as autumn leaves. "Tom," called Sarah Martinez, our cave rescue specialist. "Look at this." She was standing just inside the mine entrance, shining her flashlight down the main tunnel. The beam caught something on the ground about 50 feet in. More pages, but also something else. A red neckerchief, the kind the Boy Scouts wore. "That's fresh," I said, moving toward the entrance. "Can't be more than a day old." The tunnel stretched back into darkness, supported by rotting wooden beams that creaked in the wind. According to the old mining maps, the main shaft went back about 300 feet before branching into smaller tunnels. Most of them had collapsed decades ago, but the main passage was still open. I made the decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "Sarah, take Jim and Bobby down the main tunnel. Standard cave rescue protocol. Stay roped together. Check in every 10 minutes. I'll monitor from up here." They disappeared into the darkness, their lights getting smaller and smaller until they were just pinpricks in the black. For the first 20 minutes, everything went according to plan. Regular radio check-ins, steady progress deeper into the mine. Then things started getting strange. "Base, this is Sarah. We've been walking for about an hour now, but my watch says it's only been 20 minutes. I checked my own watch. She was right, they'd been down there exactly 22 minutes. "Must be the stress," I radioed back. "Time feels different underground. Keep moving." But 10 minutes later, Sarah's voice came through the radio again, and she sounded confused. "Tom, we're hearing something down here. Sounds like kids singing." I felt my blood go cold. "Say again?" Children's voices, echoing from deeper in the tunnel. They're singing "Ring Around the Rosie," all in harmony, like a choir. The other team members looked at each other. We all knew there was no way 12 scared boys would be sitting around singing nursery rhymes in a pitch-black mine shaft. "How much farther does this tunnel go?" Jim's voice crackled through. "According to the maps, we should have hit the collapse section by now, but it just keeps going." I pulled out the mining survey from 1952. The main tunnel was marked as ending in a cave-in at 280 feet. My team had been walking for 40 minutes at a steady pace. They should have been at the end already. "Tom," Sarah's voice again, but now it sounded dreamy, distant. "The kids are here. We found them. They're okay." Relief flooded through me. "Thank God. Are they hurt? Do you need medical gear?" Silence for a long moment. Then, "They want us to play with them. Such nice children. They've been waiting for us." Something in her voice made my skin crawl. Sarah Martinez was a professional, trained in emergency psychology. She didn't talk like that. "Sarah, I need you to bring those boys out now. It's getting cold up here, and we need to get them checked by a medic." "But Tom," came Jim's voice, "they're not cold at all. Look how warm it is down here. Look at the lights." I checked the thermal readings on my equipment. The temperature in the mine should have been in the 40s, cold enough to see your breath. But my instruments were showing readings in the 70s from deep inside the tunnel. That's when the singing started. It drifted up from the mine entrance, faint but clear. Children's voices in perfect harmony, singing the same nursery rhyme over and over. "Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down." But there was something wrong with the melody. It was too slow, too sad, like a funeral song instead of a children's game. And I counted the voices. More than 12 children were singing down there in the dark. I had to go down. Every instinct I'd developed in Korea, every regulation in the search and rescue manual, told me not to enter that mine alone. But my team wasn't responding to radio calls anymore. And 12 kids were somewhere in that darkness. I clipped into my rappelling gear and started down the main tunnel, following the rope Sarah's team had left behind. My headlamp cut through the black, throwing shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The tunnel was longer than it should have been, much longer. According to my GPS, when it worked, I'd walked almost half a mile underground. The mining maps showed this shaft ending at less than 300 feet. But here I was, still following rope through passages that the maps said didn't exist. The wooden support beams looked wrong too. Some of them were new, rough-cut timber that still smelled of pine sap. Others were ancient, so rotted they crumbled when I touched them. It was like different sections of the mine existed in different time periods. That's when I heard the children's laughter. Not scared crying or calls for help, actual laughter, echoing from somewhere ahead of me. Happy, playful sounds like kids on a playground, but underneath it, something else. A wet, sucking sound, like water draining down a pipe. I found Sarah, Jim, and Bobby about a quarter mile in, sitting in a circle in a wide chamber I'd never seen on any map. Their headlamps were off, but somehow they could see fine. They were staring at empty air and smiling. "Sarah," I called out. "Sarah, look at me." She turned toward my voice, but her eyes didn't focus. It was like she was looking through me at something else. "We're playing hide and seek," she said in a voice like a little girl's. "The children taught us. They're so good at hiding." "What children?" I shined my light around the chamber. Besides my team, it was empty. "Right there." Bobby pointed at nothing. "Can't you see them? They're beautiful." I grabbed Sarah by the shoulders and shook her. She felt cold, too cold, like she'd been sitting in freezing water. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and when I checked her pulse, it was slow and weak. "We need to get out of here," I said. "All of you, stand up, we're leaving." But they wouldn't move. They just sat there, smiling at things I couldn't see, while that wet sucking sound got louder. That's when I saw the Boy Scouts. They were deeper in the chamber, arranged in their own circle. 12 boys in scout uniforms, sitting perfectly still with their eyes rolled back in their heads. They were breathing, but barely. And their skin had the same gray pallor as my team. But they weren't alone. Standing behind each boy was a child, pale, thin kids in old-fashioned clothes, mining clothes from 100 years ago, with suspenders and cloth caps. Their faces were smudged with coal dust, and their eyes were completely black. The hollow children. I could see them now, clear as day. They had their hands on the scouts' shoulders, and where they touched, the boy's life seemed to be draining away. Getting older, grayer, smaller. "Hello, Mr. Ranger," said the nearest hollow child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 when she died. "We've been waiting for you." Her voice was my daughter's voice. Emily, safe at home with her mother, but somehow this dead thing was speaking with her words. "These children were lost," said another hollow child, this one a boy with a crushed skull visible through his mining cap. "We're taking care of them now." "Let them go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Take me instead." The hollow children laughed, and the sound echoed off the chamber walls like breaking glass. "Oh, we will," said the girl with Emily's voice. "But first, we need them strong enough for the journey. We're going home, Mr. Ranger. After so many years in the dark, we're finally going home." The chamber started to change around me. The walls rippled like water, and suddenly I could see other tunnels, other chambers stretching back into the mountain. Dozens of them, hundreds, filled with more hollow children than I could count. And in every chamber, living children sat in circles, growing older and weaker while the hollow ones fed. "You see," said a new voice, and I turned to see the largest of the hollow children, a boy about 14, with coal dust thick on his face and overalls torn from the cave-in that killed him. "We've been so hungry, so cold. But now we have enough strength to leave this place." He gestured to the dying scouts. 12 young lives should be enough to free us from the mine, to let us walk in the sunlight again, to find new children to play with. The walls of the chamber showed me visions. The hollow children walking out of the mine, spreading through the mountains, visiting houses where children slept. I saw Emily's bedroom, saw pale figures standing around her bed while she dreamed. "No," I whispered. "Yes," said the boy with Emily's voice. "We know where you live, Mr. Ranger. We know where all the children live." The rope I'd followed into the mine was gone. The entrance tunnel had vanished. There was no way out except through chambers full of hungry dead children, and they were all looking at me now with their black, empty eyes. Behind me, I heard Sarah start to sing, "Ring Around the Rosie, Pocket Full of Posies." Her voice was getting younger, smaller, as the hollow children drained more of her life away. The hollow children weren't just feeding, they were remembering. As they drained life from the scouts, I could see their own memories playing out on the chamber walls like old movies. The cave-in of 1,897, 23 children trapped in the dark. The hunger that came after, the cold. The slow realization that they were dead but couldn't die. "We were just like them," whispered the girl with Emily's voice, pointing at the dying scouts. "Young, afraid. But then we learned to be strong." I watched their memories of the first time someone entered the mine after the collapse. A search party in 1898, looking for the missing children. The hollow ones had been so hungry, so desperate for warmth and life. They'd taken it all. "Every few years, someone comes," said the oldest boy. "Hikers, treasure hunters, children on dares. We take what we need to stay strong, but it's never enough. Never enough to leave this place." He looked at the 12 scouts, at my 3 team members. "But this is different. This is enough life force to free us all, to walk above ground again." The chamber walls showed me what would happen next. The hollow children leaving the mine, spreading through West Virginia, through the entire Appalachian range. Visiting every house with children, feeding until they were strong enough to never be hungry again. I thought about Emily asleep in her bed. About Jimmy Morrison's boy, somewhere in this chamber. About every parent in these mountains who thought their children were safe. "There has to be another way," I said. "There is," said the girl. "Trade places with them. Give us your life, all of it, and we'll let the children go." I almost said yes, but then I realized the truth. They were lying. Even if I gave them my life, they'd already tasted the scouts' energy. They wouldn't stop with just me. "You want to know the real secret, Mr. Ranger?" said the oldest boy. "We remember everything about being alive, the games we played, the songs we sang, the way it felt to be warm." He leaned closer, and I could smell death on his breath. "But we've forgotten how we died." That's when I understood. The hollow children stayed strong by remembering life, by playing the games and singing the songs of living children. But they'd buried their own deaths so deep they couldn't remember the pain, the fear, the moment they stopped being alive and became something else. I had an idea, probably a stupid idea that would get us all killed, but it was the only chance we had. I started talking about the cave-in. 1,897, I said loudly. "October 15th. You were working the deep shafts when the support beams failed." The hollow children went very still. "The first timber broke around noon. You heard it crack, but the foreman told you to keep working. Then the second beam went, and the third. And suddenly, the whole tunnel was coming down." "Stop," whispered the girl. "You ran for the entrance, but you were too deep." 23 children, the youngest only 7 years old. The darkness came so fast. The chamber walls started showing different memories now. Not the games and songs, but the terror, the crushing weight, the slow realization that no one was coming to save them. "You died in the dark," I continued, "scared and alone and calling for your mothers. You died, and you've been dead for 70 years. "Stop!" screamed all the hollow children at once. But I couldn't stop, because it was working. As they remembered their deaths, they were losing their grip on the living children. The scouts started breathing deeper, color returning to their faces. "You're not children anymore," I said. "You're just echoes. Just hunger and cold and emptiness, pretending to be alive." The hollow children were changing, becoming transparent, their perfect child faces showing the damage underneath. Crushed skulls, broken ribs, coal dust in their lungs. "We are alive!" the oldest boy screamed. "We are real." "No," I said quietly. You're dead. You died 70 years ago, and it's time to stop pretending otherwise. The chamber started collapsing, but not from cave-ins. Reality was reasserting itself. The walls that had shown impossible visions became just stone again. The maze of tunnels collapsed back into the simple shaft that had always been there. The hollow children were fading, but they weren't going quietly. "If we can't have these children," snarled the girl with Emily's voice, "then no one can." She lunged for the nearest scout, her touch now burning cold instead of draining warm. I tackled her, and it was like grabbing a piece of winter itself. Pain shot through my hands where I touched her, frostbite forming instantly on my fingers. But I held on. "Let them go," I gasped. "You're dead. Let them live." For just a moment, the girl's face changed. The black eyes became brown, normal, human. She looked confused, lost. "I want to go home," she whispered. "I want my mama." "I know," I said. "I know you do, but this isn't the way." She nodded once, then crumbled to dust in my arms. One by one, the other hollow children faded, finally accepting what they'd been denying for 70 years. The chamber became just a chamber again, part of the old mine system that had been there all along. I gathered up the scouts, carried the ones who couldn't walk, and led everyone back toward the surface. My team was confused, disoriented, but alive. The boys were weak but breathing normally. We made it out, just as the old mine shaft finally collapsed for real, sealing the darkness behind us forever. 8 of the 12 scouts made it home alive. The other 4 had aged decades in a single night. Their hair was white, their faces lined with wrinkles, their bodies bent like old men. The doctors couldn't explain it. The government men who showed up called it methane poisoning, mass hallucination from bad air in the mine. They sealed the whole area, brought in equipment to fill the shafts with concrete. Official cause of the incident: gas leak causing oxygen deprivation and shared delusional episodes. Case closed. But I know what really happened down there. And I know it's not over. Since that night, I've started seeing things. Hollow spaces where something has been feeding. Empty lots where children used to play. Basements that feel too cold. Attics where the shadows move wrong. The hollow children might be gone from Blackrock Mine, but they weren't the only ones. Mrs. Patterson was right about that. These mountains are full of old mines, old tragedies, old hungers that never got properly buried. My own children are safe, for now. Emily still talks about the cold friends who visit her dreams sometimes, but they don't seem to be getting stronger. Sarah's doing okay too, though she transferred out of search and rescue. "Can't handle caves anymore," she says. The Morrison boy, Jimmy Jr., was one of the 4 who aged. He's 18 years old, but looks 60, and his eyes are the saddest thing I've ever seen. Sometimes he talks about playing games in the dark, about children who taught him songs he can't quite remember. I still work these mountains, still pull people out when they get lost or hurt. But now I carry extra equipment: salt, iron, things the old-timers said would keep spirits away. Probably doesn't work, but it helps me sleep. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows through the hollows just right, I can hear children singing. Different children, from different mines, different tragedies, all of them hungry, all of them waiting for someone to come play. The mountains keep their secrets well. But they also keep their dead. If you're planning to camp in the Monongahela, if you're bringing your kids up into these hills, remember this story. Not all the children you meet in the woods are alive. And not all of them want to play nice games. Listen for the singing, watch for the cold spots. And if your children start talking about new friends who only come out after dark, maybe it's time to pack up and head home. Some games aren't worth playing. The hollow children are still out there, in mines all through Appalachia, still hungry, still waiting. And they remember your children's faces now. My name is Thomas Ashford, and I've been keeping these mountains safe for 16 years. But some things are beyond any ranger's power to stop. Some things are just too hungry to stay dead. My name is William Stonecrow, and I've been a park ranger for 19 years. People think they know what that means: walking trails, giving directions to lost tourists, maybe dealing with the odd bear. They don't know about the things that happen in the deep woods, the things we don't put in our reports. The Great Smoky Mountains have been my home since I was born. My grandfather used to tell me stories about these mountains when I was little. Cherokee stories about spirits that lived in the rocks and trees. About the Mountain King, Itznotere, an old medicine man who made a deal with dark spirits and became something else, something hungry. I always thought they were just stories. It was March 1974 when everything changed. The spring snow was melting, and the trails were muddy but clear. Perfect hunting weather, or so 3 experienced hunters thought when they headed up to Cataract Falls. These weren't weekend warriors. Joe Martinez had been hunting these mountains for 20 years. His brother Carlos knew every trail like his own backyard. Their friend, Tommy Burke, could track a deer through solid rock. They should have come back. When their wives called the ranger station on Monday morning, I wasn't too worried. Hunters got turned around sometimes, especially with the weather changing so fast this time of year. But by Tuesday, I was loading my pack and heading up to find them. I knew something was wrong the moment I hit the trail to Cataract Falls. The birds were quiet. Not just less singing, completely silent. In 19 years of walking these mountains, I'd never heard quiet like that. Even the insects had stopped buzzing. The air felt thick, like before a bad storm, but the sky was clear blue. I found their truck at the trailhead, keys still in the ignition. 3 sleeping bags in the back, still rolled up neat. Whatever happened to them, it happened fast. No time to pack up camp. The trail to the falls was about 3 miles through old-growth forest. I'd walked it 1,000 times, but today it felt different. Wrong. The trees seemed to lean in closer than usual. Shadows fell in strange directions, and that smell, like copper pennies and rotting leaves, kept following me no matter which way the wind blew. I was about halfway to the falls when I found the first sign of trouble: Joe Martinez's hat, hanging from a branch 12 feet off the ground. No way it could have blown up there. The tree trunk was smooth bark with no handholds, but there it was, like someone had just placed it there real careful. That's when I started talking into my radio, letting dispatch know I might need backup. 2 hours later, I found Joe. He was inside a tree, not behind it or under it. Inside it, a big old oak that had to be 200 years old, hollow in the center like they sometimes get. But Joe wasn't just hiding in there. He was wedged into that hollow space like he'd been pressed in from all sides. His body was twisted in ways that made my stomach turn. No blood, no broken bones that I could see. Just empty, like something had drained all the life right out of him. The tree bark showed no damage, no tool marks, no signs of force. It was like the tree had opened up, swallowed him, and closed again. I called for the full investigation team and the coroner. While I waited, I kept looking at that tree. The bark around where Joe was trapped had a shine to it, like it was still wet. When I touched it, my finger came away red. The tree was bleeding sap that looked just like blood. My grandfather's voice started whispering in the back of my mind. Stories about trees that could walk, rocks that could think, mountains that got angry when people didn't show proper respect. Just stories. I told myself out loud. Just old stories. But my voice sounded small in that silent forest. The coroner, Dr. Helen Kim, drove up from Knoxville that afternoon. She'd seen everything in 30 years of mountain medicine: nega, bear attacks, falls, exposure, hunting accidents. But when she examined Joe Martinez's body, her face went pale. "William," she said, pulling me aside, "this man has no blood in him. None. It's like something just drained him dry. But there's not a mark on his body. No puncture wounds, no tears, nothing. Could be some kind of animal attack we haven't seen before," I suggested. She shook her head. "What animal drains blood without leaving bite marks? And how did he end up inside that tree?" We were standing there trying to make sense of it when the temperature dropped 30 degrees in about 10 minutes. One moment we were sweating in the afternoon sun, the next we could see our breath. Clouds rolled in fast, bringing snow that shouldn't exist in late March. "We need to find the other 2, I said, fast. Dr. Kim headed back to town with Joe's body. I radioed for more rangers and kept searching. The snow was coming down thick now, making it hard to see more than 20 feet ahead. But I could follow Carlos Martinez's trail easy enough. He wore size 13 boots with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. The tracks led away from camp toward the falls, then just stopped. right in the middle of the trail. Like Carlos had been walking along and then vanished into thin air. I circled the area 3 times, looking for where he might have left the trail. Nothing. That's when I heard the crying. It was coming from up ahead, near a cluster of big rocks we called Giant's Table. Carlos's voice, calling for help, weak and scared. I ran toward the sound, following it around behind the rocks. "Carlos, where are you?" "Down here." His voice was muffled, like it was coming from underground. "Help me, I can't move." I looked down and saw solid rock. Granite that had been there for millions of years. But Carlos's voice was definitely coming from inside it. "Where exactly are you?" I called out. "I'm trapped in the rock. It closed around me. Please, you have to get me out." I ran my hands over the stone surface. It was smooth and cold, no cracks or openings anywhere. But I could hear Carlos clear as day, maybe 3 feet down inside solid rock. "How did you get in there?" "I don't know. I was running from something and I fell against this rock and it opened up like mud and then closed around me. I can barely breathe." I keyed my radio. "This is Stonecrow. I need a rescue team with drilling equipment at Giant's Table immediately. I've got a man trapped inside solid rock." The response crackled back. "Say again, Stonecrow. Did you say inside rock?" "That's correct. I can hear him, but I can't see any way in." 3 hours later, we had a full rescue crew working with diamond-tipped drills. The sound echoed through the forest like screaming. We worked through the night, taking turns at the drill. Carlos kept talking to us, his voice getting weaker. When we finally broke through, the drill bit came out covered in blood. Carlos was dead, crushed by the weight of solid rock, but somehow preserved in a perfect pocket of air. The medical examiner said it looked like he'd been squeezed to death slowly, over hours. The rock around him showed no signs of being disturbed. It was like he'd always been there, like the mountain had grown around him. "This is impossible," the lead rescue coordinator kept saying. "Rock doesn't just open and close. Rock doesn't move." But I was remembering more of my grandfather's stories, about mountains that were alive, about the old spirits that could make stone flow like water when they were angry. We found Tommy Burke the next morning. He was at the bottom of Cataract Falls, except the water was flowing upward. The 200-foot waterfall that I'd seen thousands of times was running backward, from the bottom to the top. Tommy's body was trapped in the rushing water, tumbling over and over. But he couldn't drown because the water kept pushing him up instead of down. By the time we got ropes down to pull him out, he'd been dead for hours. "Doctor," Kim said, his lungs were full of water, but the wrong kind of water. Spring water instead of the stream water from the falls. Like he'd drowned somewhere else entirely. The waterfall went back to normal the moment we got Tommy's body out. Just switched direction like someone had flipped a switch. That's when I started believing my grandfather's stories weren't just stories. And that's when I realized something was hunting in my mountains. Something that could control water and stone and trees. Something that didn't want strangers in its territory. Something that might not be finished killing. I called my Aunt Sarah that night. She was what the Cherokee Nation called a medicine woman, keeper of the old knowledge, the spiritual traditions that most people had forgotten. If anyone could help me understand what was happening, it was her. 3 men dead in impossible ways, I told her over the phone. Trees that swallow people, rocks that move, water flowing uphill. What am I dealing with, Aunt Sarah? The line was quiet for a long time. Then, have you seen the signs? What signs? Cherokee symbols, cut into trees or stones. They would be fresh, bleeding sap, growing larger. My blood went cold. I had seen them, strange markings carved deep into bark near each place we'd found bodies. I'd thought they were just random scratches, maybe from animals. Yes, I said. I've seen them. Then it's not what, it's who. And I'm coming up there tonight. Sarah Wildfire was 73 years old and barely 5 feet tall, but she could hike through mountains that exhausted men half her age. She arrived at the ranger station at sunrise, carrying a leather bag that smelled like sage and cedar. "Tell me everything," she said. "Leave nothing out." I told her about the victims, about the impossible ways they'd died, about the waterfall and the bleeding trees. She listened without interrupting, her dark eyes getting more worried with each detail. "It's Atsila," she said finally. "The Mountain King. I hope the old stories weren't true, but tell me about him." Sarah set down her bag and looked out toward the mountains. 300 years ago, there was a medicine man named Atsila. He was powerful, but he wanted more power. He made a deal with dark spirits, things that weren't Cherokee, weren't even from this world. They gave him control over the mountain itself, made him its king. But the power corrupted him. He started demanding sacrifices. Human sacrifices. What happened to him? The other medicine men banished him, trapped his spirit in the mountain, bound him with sacred ceremonies. He was supposed to sleep forever. But something has woken him up. As if on cue, my radio crackled to life. All units to Cataract Falls area. We have hikers reporting impossible weather conditions and animal attacks. Sarah and I looked at each other. He's not finished, she said. We drove up to the falls with a full response team, 6 rangers, 2 EMTs, and a wildlife specialist. The moment we got out of our vehicles, we could feel it. The air was wrong, too thick, too warm, and it tasted like metal. The forest around the falls had changed overnight. Trees that had been growing straight for decades were now twisted into spirals. New plants had sprouted between the rocks, thorny vines with red flowers that looked like tiny skulls. And the sound of water falling was all wrong, like screams mixed with rushing water. "Radio check," I called. Static answered me. All our radios were dead. "Stay together," I told the team. "Whatever you see, don't split up." We'd gone maybe 50 yards when the attack started. First, it was the ravens. Dozens of them, diving out of the trees with their claws extended, but these weren't normal birds. Their eyes glowed red like coals, and when they cawed, it sounded like words. Cherokee words that I recognized from childhood ceremonies. Death songs. The wildlife specialist, Janet Cross, tried to use her tranquilizer gun on them. The dart passed right through the nearest raven like it was made of smoke. The bird reformed instantly and raked its claws across her face. "They're not real animals," she screamed, blood running down her cheek. "There's something else." That's when the bears showed up. 3 black bears, each one bigger than any I'd ever seen. But they moved wrong, like puppets on strings. Their fur was patchy and rotting, showing gray skin underneath. And their eyes were the same glowing red as the ravens. "Form a circle," I shouted. "Back to back. Use the bear spray." The spray had no effect. The bears just walked through the cloud of pepper like it was morning mist. They circled us slowly, and I could hear them, laughing. Deep, rumbling sounds that no bear should be able to make. Sarah stepped forward, pulling a small drum from her bag. She started singing in Cherokee, her voice cutting through the unnatural sounds of the forest. The moment her song began, the bears stopped moving. "The mountain is testing us," she called out. "It wants to know if we'll run or fight. What do? We show respect. But we don't back down." Sarah's song got louder, and I started to understand some of the words. She was singing to the mountain itself, acknowledging its power but demanding safe passage. The bears tilted their heads, listening. Then the ground started shaking. Not an earthquake, Evie, something more focused. The rocks under our feet rose and fell like breathing. Cracks opened in the earth, releasing air that smelled like rotting meat. From the largest crack, something began to climb out. It was huge, at least 10 feet tall, and made of stone and wood and shadow all twisted together. Its face was carved rock, but the features kept changing. One moment it looked like a Cherokee elder, the next like something from a nightmare. When it spoke, its voice was like boulders grinding together. "Who disturbs my mountain?" it demanded in perfect Cherokee. Sarah stopped drumming. "I am Sarah Wildfire, granddaughter of Joseph Wildfire, keeper of the old traditions. We seek the truth about the deaths of these men." The Mountain King laughed, and trees around us started bleeding sap. "Truth? The truth is that this mountain belongs to me. These men were trespassers. They paid the price. They were just hunting," I said, stepping forward. "They meant no harm." The creature's burning eyes fixed on me. "William Stonecrow, you carry Cherokee blood, but you wear the white man's uniform. You have forgotten the old ways." "I haven't forgotten anything. Then you know what I am. You know my power. You know that I could crush you like insects." The air around us started spinning, forming a whirlwind that lifted leaves and small rocks. The other rangers were backing away, but Sarah grabbed my arm. "Don't show fear," she whispered. "If you run, he'll hunt you forever." The Mountain King raised one massive arm, and lightning flashed in the clear sky. I offer you a choice, grandson of the people. Leave my mountain and never return. Take your men and your machines and go. Do this, and I will let you live. And if I refuse? The creature smiled, showing teeth made of black obsidian. Then you will join the others, and your death will be much slower. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and the wind picked up. The Mountain King was giving us a demonstration of his power, showing us what he could do if we didn't obey. But Sarah was still holding my arm, still singing softly under her breath. And in her song, I heard something the Mountain King didn't expect. I heard the real Cherokee words of power, the ones that could bind dark to spirits. You're not Cherokee, Sarah said suddenly, her voice cutting through the wind. You never were. The Mountain King's stone face twisted in anger. How dare you? Atsila was Cherokee, Sarah continued, raising her voice. But you're not Atsila, you're something else. Something that killed him and took his place. The creature's form began to shimmer and change. For a moment, I saw through the disguise to what lay underneath. It wasn't human at all. It was something ancient and hungry, made of darkness and hate, something that had been feeding on the mountain's spiritual energy for centuries. Clever woman, it hissed. But it changes nothing. This mountain is mine now. These people are mine to harvest. Harvest? I stepped forward, understanding hitting me like a physical blow. You've been feeding on them. That's why there was no blood in the bodies. You drained them. The false Mountain King laughed. Blood, life force, fear, pain, it all nourishes me. And there are so many tourists now, so many hikers and hunters. An endless feast. Sarah was pulling items from her bag, sage bundles, carved stones, a piece of obsidian shaped like a knife. William, I need you to keep it talking. I have to prepare the binding ceremony. What binding ceremony? The one your grandfather should have taught you, the one that will trap this thing forever. The entity heard her and roared in fury. The ground shook so hard that trees started falling. Ravens filled the sky, blocking out the sun. The temperature dropped below freezing in seconds. You cannot bind me, old woman. I am beyond your small magic. We'll see about that, Sarah muttered, arranging her sacred objects in a circle. The Mountain King turned its attention to me. You still have a choice, William Stonecrow. Walk away. Let the old woman die. Save yourself and your men. I looked at my fellow rangers, huddled together and terrified. I thought about Joe Martinez and his brother Carlos, about Tommy Burke, at the bottom of that impossible waterfall. I thought about all the hikers and hunters who might come to these mountains in the future. No, I said. This ends now. The creature's eyes blazed brighter. Then you will all die slowly. It raised both arms, and the mountain itself began to move. Rocks flew through the air like missiles. The ground cracked open in a dozen places, releasing more of those rotting meat smells. Trees uprooted themselves and started walking, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. But Sarah was ready. She lit the sage bundle and began to sing, not in Cherokee this time, but in a language older than human speech. The words seemed to come from the earth itself, from the rocks and roots and deep water. Power words that made my bones vibrate. The Mountain King realized what she was doing and lunged toward her. I threw myself between them, knowing I couldn't stop something that size but hoping to buy Sarah a few more seconds. The creature hit me like a truck. I felt ribs crack as I flew backward into a tree. Pain shot through my chest, and I tasted blood. But Sarah kept singing. The sacred circle she'd drawn began to glow with soft white light. The light spread outward, pushing back the shadows and the twisted trees. Where it touched the Mountain King, the false form started to dissolve. No, the entity screamed. I will not be bound again. It changed tactics, abandoning its stone form and becoming pure shadow. The darkness flowed toward Sarah like black water, trying to overwhelm her before she could complete the ceremony. That's when my grandfather's voice spoke in my mind, clear as if he was standing right beside me. Use your blood, grandson. Cherokee blood carries power. I pulled out my pocket knife and cut my palm. Blood dripped onto the ground, and where it landed, new light appeared. The light formed a barrier between the shadow and Sarah, giving her the protection she needed. Hold it back, William, she called out. Just a few more minutes. The shadow pressed against my blood-light barrier, testing its strength. I could feel it trying to get inside my head, whispering promises and threats. I could make you powerful, it hissed. I could give you control over these mountains. All you have to do is stop her. Not interested, I said through gritted teeth. Your children, then. I know where they live. I could visit them next. That made me angry. Real angry. I squeezed my cut hand tighter, letting more blood flow. The barrier got brighter. You won't touch my family. Then stop the woman. No. Sarah's song reached a crescendo, and the obsidian knife in her hands began to glow like a star. She raised it high and brought it down, not to cut anything physical, but to cut through the spiritual bonds that held the entity to our world. The shadow let out a scream that shattered windows in our vehicles half a mile away. It writhed and twisted, trying to escape the binding circle, but Sarah's ceremony was too strong. You cannot hold me forever, it shrieked as the light pulled it downward, back into the earth. I will escape, I will return. Maybe, Sarah said calmly, but not in our lifetime, and those who come after us will know what to watch for. The entity was pulled down into the ground with a final, furious howl. The circle of light flashed once, then faded. The twisted trees straightened. The temperature returned to normal. The ravens flew away, cawing like normal birds. It was over. Sarah slumped to her knees, exhausted. I crawled over to check on her, my ribs screaming with every movement. Is it dead? I asked. Not dead. Bound. Trapped in the deep places of the mountain where it can't feed or escape. But William. She grabbed my arm with surprising strength. This thing wasn't Cherokee. It was something else, something that's been here much longer. And if there's one, there might be others. I helped her to her feet and looked around at my fellow rangers. They were all staring at us like we'd just performed a miracle. Which, I guess, we had. The official report blamed the deaths on a series of freak accidents, rock slides, flash floods, and equipment failures. The strange weather was attributed to an unusual high-pressure system. The impossible physical evidence was classified and sealed away in government files that few people would ever see. Doctor, Kim asked me privately what really happened. I told her the truth, and she listened without laughing or calling me crazy. So there are things out there that science can't explain? She asked. More than you'd think, I said, but most of them just want to be left alone. The families of the 3 hunters were told their loved ones died in a tragic accident. We held a memorial service at the base of Cataract Falls. I spoke about how much Joe, Carlos, and Tommy loved these mountains, and how the mountains would remember them. I didn't mention that the mountains had killed them. Sarah stayed with me for a week after the incident, teaching me things my grandfather should have passed down. Cherokee ceremonies for protecting sacred places. Words of power that could bind dark spirits. How to recognize when something supernatural was stirring in the forest. You're going to need this knowledge, she told me. What we faced here, it's not the only one. There are old things sleeping in mountains all across America. Things that predate human civilization. And some of them are starting to wake up. She was right. Over the next few months, I got reports from other park rangers about strange incidents. Hikers disappearing in impossible ways, animals behaving aggressively without explanation, weather patterns that defied all logic. The Cherokee Nation established a new position, spiritual guardians for sacred sites. Sarah recommended me for the Smoky Mountains region. My official title was still park ranger, but now I had additional responsibilities, watching for signs of supernatural activity, protecting visitors from threats they couldn't understand, keeping the old knowledge alive. 3 years later, I felt the mountains stir again. Not the same entity. That one was still safely bound, but something new. Something that had been drawn by the spiritual disturbance from our battle with the Mountain King. This time, I was ready. I've been protecting these mountains for 22 years now. Most days, it's just normal ranger work, etc., helping lost hikers, cleaning up campsites, dealing with bears that get too comfortable around humans. But sometimes, when the moon is dark and the wind carries strange sounds, I have to do other kinds of work. The work my grandfather should have taught me. The work that keeps the monsters in the deep places where they belong. People visit the Smoky Mountains by the millions every year. They see the beauty, the wildlife, the stunning views. They take their pictures and buy their souvenirs and go home with wonderful memories. They don't know about the things that watch them from the shadows. The ancient spirits that could crush them without effort if they chose to. Most of the time, those spirits choose not to. They remember the old agreements, the ceremonies that keep the peace between their world and ours. But sometimes, one of them forgets. And when that happens, they call me. My name is William Stonecrow, and I protect the mountains from the things that hunt in them, and I protect the people from the things they don't believe in. Because the most dangerous monsters are the ones you never see coming. My name is Michael Cragwood, and I've been a forest ranger for 13 years now. Before that, I spent 15 years working deep underground in the coal mines of Kentucky. People always ask me why I switched from mining to trees. The answer is simple. I wanted to breathe clean air for once in my life. But sometimes, your past doesn't let you go that easy. It was October 15th, 1981, when Sheriff Patterson called me about the Blackheart mine. I was sitting in my ranger station in Daniel Boone National Forest, going through some boring paperwork about trail maintenance. The phone rang, and Patterson's voice sounded shaky. "Michael, we got a situation at the old Blackheart mine. Need your expertise." I leaned back in my chair. That mine's been sealed since the cave-in 3 years ago. Nobody should be anywhere near it. That's the problem. We found 14 men inside, all dead. My coffee cup stopped halfway to my mouth. "What do you mean, inside?" "The entrance was sealed with concrete blocks. That's what we thought too. But somehow, these guys got in." "And Michael," Patterson paused. "They didn't die from a cave-in or gas leak. They just stopped breathing." I knew the Blackheart mine well. I'd worked there for 2 years before the cave-in in 1978. Lost 3 good friends that day. The mine was dangerous even by coal mining standards. Old tunnels, bad air circulation, and coal dust so thick you could taste it for days after your shift. "I'll be there in an hour," I told Patterson. The drive to Blackheart took me through Laurel Fork Hollow, a valley so narrow that the sun only hit the bottom for a few hours each day. The trees were already turning orange and red, but they looked sick somehow. Their leaves were falling too early, creating a carpet of decay that crunched under my truck tires. When I arrived at the mine site, I saw 3 police cars, an ambulance, and a van from the Mine Safety and Health Administration. Yellow tape surrounded the entrance, and men in hard hats were standing around looking confused. Jim Bradley from MSHA walked over to me. We'd worked together before on mine safety inspections. He looked pale. "Thanks for coming, Michael. This is the strangest thing I've seen in 20 years. He led me to the mine entrance. The concrete blocks that sealed it were still in place, but there was a hole just big enough for a man to crawl through. The edges of the hole were smooth, like the concrete had been carved away with a laser. "When did you notice this opening?" I asked. "That's just it. It wasn't here yesterday. The state inspector checked this site last week. The seal was perfect." We walked closer to the entrance. I could smell something wrong in the air. Not gas. I would recognize that immediately. This was different. Like old coal dust mixed with something rotten. "Where exactly did you find the bodies?" Jim handed me a flashlight. "About 200 feet in the main chamber. They're still down there. Coroner's afraid to move them until we figure out what killed them." I put on my hard hat and checked my portable gas detector. The readings were normal. "Any identification on the victims?" "That's another weird thing. They're all local miners, but they haven't worked together in years. Some of them retired, others work different mines now. No reason for them to be here together." As we walked toward the entrance, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The coal dust around the mine opening wasn't sitting still like it should. It was moving slightly, like it was alive. Just tiny movements, but enough to catch my eye. "Jim, look at this dust." He knelt down beside me. Probably just the wind. But there was no wind. The air was completely still. I took a deep breath and crawled through the hole into the Blackheart mine. The familiar smell of coal and dampness hit me, bringing back memories I'd tried to forget. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, showing the wooden support beams and rusty rail tracks that led deeper into the mountain. As we walked deeper, our footsteps echoed strangely. The sound seemed to bounce back from places where there shouldn't be any walls. I'd mapped this mine section by section during my mining days, and something felt different about the layout. "The bodies are just ahead," Jim whispered. Then I saw them. 14 men sitting in a perfect circle around an old mining cart. Their eyes were closed, and they looked peaceful, like they'd just decided to take a nap. No signs of panic, no clawing at their throats, no desperate attempts to escape. They'd simply sat down and died. But what really scared me was what I saw in their mouths. Black coal dust was slowly trickling out, like they'd been eating it. And the dust on the ground around them wasn't staying put either. It moved in small patterns, almost like it was trying to spell something. I knelt down next to the nearest body and checked my gas detector again. Still normal. But when I looked closer at the man's face, I recognized him. Bobby Jenkins, 63 years old, retired from mining 5 years ago due to black lung disease. Every single man in that circle had the same thing, black lung disease from years of breathing coal dust. "Jim," I said quietly, "we need to get out of here." "Now." "Why? What did you find?" But before I could answer, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Deep in the mine, from tunnels that should have been empty, came the sound of mining equipment. Thick axes hitting rock, shovels scraping against stone. The steady rhythm of men working. The sounds were coming from areas that had been sealed off since the 1950 seconds. 3 days later, I couldn't get the image of those 14 dead men out of my head. The official cause of death was suffocation, but the coroner found something impossible. Their lungs were completely filled with coal dust. Not just coated with it like you'd expect from miners, packed solid, like someone had poured it down their throats. But when Dr. Martinez looked at the coal dust under a microscope, she called me immediately. "Michael, you need to see this. The dust samples from the victim's lungs. They're moving." I drove to the hospital lab that afternoon. Dr. Martinez led me to her microscope and told me to look. Under the lens, I could see tiny particles of coal dust, but they weren't floating randomly like they should. They moved together, like a school of fish or a flock of birds, like they had a purpose. "This is impossible," I said. "Coal dust is just rock particles. It can't move on its own." That's what I thought too, but watch this. She tapped the glass slide with her finger. Immediately, all the dust particles moved toward the sound, clustering together in a black spot. It responds to vibration, almost like it's listening. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the mining sounds we'd heard deep in the Blackheart mine. I'd been a miner long enough to know that mines don't make noise by themselves. Someone, or something, was working down there. The next morning, I called Sheriff Patterson and asked him to meet me at the mine with better equipment. If we were going deeper, I wanted gas masks, rope, extra batteries, and a radio that could reach the surface. "You sure about this, Michael? That place is giving everyone the creeps. Those men died for a reason, and until we know what that reason is, it might happen again." We met at the mine entrance at dawn. I brought Jim Bradley from MSHA and 2 experienced miners, Pete Collins and Tony Ritchie. Both had worked the deep tunnels before the mine closed. As we approached the entrance, I noticed the hole in the concrete seal had gotten bigger. What had been barely large enough for one man was now wide enough for 2 people to walk through side by side. "Nobody's been out here since Tuesday," Patterson said. "I've had a deputy checking twice a day." Inside the mine, our flashlights revealed something new. The main tunnel, which had ended in a wall of collapsed rock, now continued deeper into the mountain. Someone had cleared away tons of rubble, creating a path that led into parts of the mine that had been closed since before I was born. "This is impossible," Pete said. "It would take a crew weeks to move that much rock, and we would have heard the machinery." We followed the new tunnel for about half a mile. The deeper we went, the more wrong everything felt. The air was too warm, and our flashlights seemed dimmer, like the darkness was fighting back against the light. Then we found the first workshop. In a chamber that had been carved out of solid rock, we discovered mining equipment that was still warm. Pickaxes with fresh scratches on the metal, shovels with wet coal dust still clinging to them. Lanterns that had been recently extinguished. I could smell the kerosene. "Someone's been working here recently," Tony whispered. "Maybe within the last few hours." But there were no footprints in the coal dust on the floor, just smooth, undisturbed black powder. Jim checked his radio. "Base camp, this is Bradley. Do you copy?" "Static. We're too deep," I said. "Radio waves can't reach us down here." That's when we heard the voices. They came from deeper in the mine, echoing through tunnels we hadn't explored yet, men talking in low voices, discussing mining techniques, complaining about working conditions. But the words sounded strange, like they were coming from very far away or through water. Pete grabbed my arm. Those voices. One of them sounds like my brother Danny. Your brother's been dead for 10 years, I reminded him. I know, Pete said, his face white with fear. He died in a mine collapse in West Virginia. We followed the voices deeper into the mountain. The tunnel branched off in directions that weren't on any map I'd ever seen. Someone had been digging new passages, extending the mine far beyond its original boundaries. In the next chamber, we found more impossible evidence. The walls were covered with fresh pick marks, but the pattern was wrong. The marks were too precise, too regular. No human miner could work with that kind of mathematical accuracy. And the coal dust on the ground was definitely moving now. It flowed like liquid, gathering in corners and along the walls. Sometimes it formed shapes that almost looked like human figures before dissolving back into random patterns. This is getting too dangerous, Jim said. We should go back and call for backup. But as we turned to leave, we discovered that the tunnel behind us had changed. The path we'd followed down was gone, replaced by solid rock wall. We were trapped. Tony started breathing heavily. How is that possible? We just came through there. I checked my gas detector again. Still normal readings, but something was definitely wrong with the air. It felt thick, almost like breathing through cotton. That's when the mining sounds started again. But this time, they were coming from all around us, above, below, and from tunnels that didn't exist on any map. The sound of dozens of men working with pick and shovel, digging deeper and deeper into the earth. And mixed in with the sounds of mining, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Men coughing. The deep, wet cough that every coal miner knows. The cough that means your lungs are filling up with dust and you don't have much time left. The coughing got louder and closer, and then I realized that Pete was coughing too, even though he was wearing a gas mask. Black dust was seeping out around the edges of his mask, like it was coming from inside his lungs. Pete, take off your mask, I said. When he did, coal dust poured out of his mouth like black water. I can't stop it, he gasped. It feels like it's alive in there. Pete collapsed to his knees, coughing up more coal dust than any human lungs could hold. The black powder didn't fall to the ground like it should have. Instead, it hung in the air around him, swirling in patterns that looked almost like faces. Get him out of here, I shouted to Tony and Jim. But when we turned toward the tunnel exit, the wall of rock was still there. We were sealed inside with whatever was happening to Pete. The coal dust around Pete began to glow with a faint, sickly light. And that's when I heard the voice. It didn't come from any direction I could point to. It seemed to speak from inside my own head, in the voices of dozens of different men all talking at once. Michael Cragwood, 15 years underground, section foreman at Bluegrass Mine. You know what it's like to breathe poison every day. I grabbed my radio, even though I knew it wouldn't work this deep. Base camp, this is Cragwood. We have an emergency situation. The voice laughed, and the sound came from everywhere at once. No one can hear you down here, Michael. This is our place now. The place where miners go when the dust finally wins. The coal dust around Pete was forming into the shape of a man, a miner in old-fashioned work clothes, with a headlamp that cast no light. His face was made of shifting black particles, constantly changing, but always maintaining the basic features of a human being. Who are you? I asked. We are everyone who ever died breathing coal dust. Every miner who coughed blood, every man who worked underground until his lungs turned black and hard as stone. We are the Black Lung. More shapes began forming out of the dust around us, dozens of miners from different time periods, all made of the same flowing black particles. Some wore modern hard hats, others had the cloth caps from the early 1900s, but they all had the same thing in common: the terrible cough of men dying from lung disease. What do you want? Jim asked, backing against the rock wall. To grow stronger. Every miner who dies from black lung disease joins us. We become more powerful with each new voice added to our collective. The entity that looked like Pete stood up, but it wasn't Pete anymore. His eyes were completely black, and when he spoke, coal dust came out instead of breath. The 14 men you found died willingly. They heard our call and came to join us. Their suffering is over now. I thought about Bobby Jenkins and the other men we'd found sitting in that circle. All of them had severe black lung disease. All of them had been suffering for years, slowly suffocating as their lungs filled with scar tissue and coal dust. "You're killing them," I said. "No," the black lung entity replied. "We're freeing them. And soon, we'll free you too, Michael. We can smell the dust in your lungs, feel the scar tissue that makes every breath a struggle. You belong with us." It was true. I'd been diagnosed with early-stage black lung disease 2 years ago. The doctor said I had maybe 10 years before it got really bad. 10 years of slowly drowning in my own lungs. "I'm not dying today," I said, checking my equipment. "And neither are my friends. Look around you, Michael. Look at what we've built." The coal dust in the air began to glow brighter, and I could see the true extent of what was happening in the mine. The entity hadn't just been clearing old tunnels, it had been creating an entire underground city. Miles of new passages stretched out in all directions, carved with perfect precision through solid rock. In chamber after chamber, I could see mining equipment operating by itself. Pickaxes swinging with no hands to guide them, shovels scraping against stone walls, coal cars rolling along tracks that led deeper and deeper into the earth. "We've been expanding this mine for 80 years, the entity said. "Every time a miner dies from black lung disease, his knowledge becomes our knowledge. His strength becomes our strength. Soon, we'll have enough power to reach every coal mine in Kentucky, then West Virginia, then Pennsylvania." "Why?" Tony asked. "What's the point?" "To end the suffering. Every miner knows he's slowly dying from the first day he goes underground. The coal dust is poison, but they breathe it anyway because they have families to feed. We offer them a choice: die slowly and alone, or join us and live forever." The peat thing walked closer to me. "You know we're right, Michael. You've seen the men with black lung disease. Watch them waste away until they can barely walk to the mailbox. We offer them dignity, purpose, power." Around us, more coal dust was gathering. I could feel it in the air, trying to force its way into my lungs despite my gas mask. The entity was getting stronger, and we were running out of time. "There has to be another way out of here," I said to Jim and Tony. "These mines always have emergency exits." But even as I said it, I could feel the coal dust working its way through the filters of my mask. My chest felt tight, and I started coughing despite myself. "Don't fight it, Michael," the black lung entity whispered. "Join us willingly, and the transition will be easier." That's when I noticed something important. The entity was strongest near the mining equipment, where the coal dust was thickest. But in areas where the air was cleaner, the dust figures became fainter, less solid. I grabbed Tony and Jim. "The ventilation shafts. If we can find where fresh air is coming in, maybe we can follow it to the surface." "The entity controls this whole mine," Jim said. "How do we know it won't just seal off any exit we find?" "Because it needs the ventilation to move around. Coal dust has to flow through air currents. If it cuts off all the airflow, it traps itself down here too." We started moving through the tunnels, looking for any sign of fresh air. Behind us, I could hear the sounds of the entity following, the scrape of mining tools and the terrible coughing of dead miners. But as we searched, I realized something that made my stomach drop. The entity wasn't just following us. It was hurting us, driving us deeper into the mine toward something specific. "Where are you taking us?" I called out. The answer came from all around us. "To meet our maker." The tunnels led us down, always down, deeper into the mountain than any mine should go. My ears were popping from the pressure, and the air was getting so thick with coal dust that our flashlights could barely cut through it. Finally, we emerged into a massive chamber that shouldn't have existed. It was bigger than a football stadium, carved out of solid rock with impossible precision. And in the center of it all was the source of everything. A mountain of coal that pulsed like a giant black heart. "Welcome to Ground Zero," the black lung entity said. Its voice was stronger here, coming from the coal mountain itself. This is where it all began. November 3rd, 1901. The Blackheart mine explosion that killed 156 miners in one instant. I stared at the pulsing coal formation. "You're telling me this thing has been growing for 80 years? Fed by the death of every coal miner in 3 states. Every man who died coughing blood added his essence to our strength. And now we're strong enough to spread beyond these mountains." Around the edges of the chamber, I could see thousands of coal dust figures. Miners from every era, all standing in perfect formation, like an army waiting for orders. Some I recognized, men I'd worked with who died from black lung disease over the years. "This ends now," I said, pulling out the explosive charges I'd brought for emergency tunnel clearing. "I'm bringing this whole place down. You can't destroy us, Michael. We are the coal itself. Blow up this mountain, and we'll just spread into the groundwater, poison the air across Kentucky." But I wasn't planning to destroy the entity. I was planning to trap it. During my 15 years of mining, I'd learned something important about coal dust. It needs air circulation to move around effectively. Cut off the airflow, and dust settles into inert piles. The entity was powerful because it could flow through miles of connected tunnels. But if I could collapse the right support structures, I could seal it into this one chamber. "Tony, Jim, help me place these charges on the main support beams. We're going to bury this thing so deep it'll never see daylight again." The coal mountain pulsed brighter, and suddenly the army of dust figures began moving toward us. Hundreds of dead miners, all reaching out with hands made of flowing black particles. "You cannot escape your destiny, Michael," the entity roared. "The coal dust is already in your lungs. You belong to us now." It was true. I could feel the dust working its way deeper into my chest with every breath. My vision was starting to blur, and I was coughing up flecks of black. But I still had enough strength left to set the charges. "Run for the tunnel entrance," I told Tony and Jim. "When I blow these supports, you'll have maybe 30 seconds before the whole chamber comes down." "What about you?" Jim asked. I looked at the detonator in my hand. "Somebody has to stay and make sure the charges go off. If the entity stops me before I can trigger them, it wins." The dust figures were getting closer. I could see the faces of men I'd known, all twisted into expressions of hunger and desperation. They wanted me to join them, to add my knowledge and experience to their collective power. "Go," I shouted. "Now!" Tony and Jim ran for the tunnel entrance while I fought my way toward the central support beam. The dust figures grabbed at me, trying to force more coal particles into my lungs. But I'd been breathing coal dust for 15 years. I knew how to keep working even when I couldn't breathe properly. I placed the last charge and armed the detonator. Around me, the coal mountain was pulsing so fast it looked like it was about to explode on its own. "Michael Cragwood," the entity said, its voice now sounding desperate. "Join us willingly, and we'll give you power beyond imagination. You could be our voice in the world above. Help us save every suffering miner." For a moment, I almost considered it. The coal dust in my lungs made every breath agony, and I knew it would only get worse over the years. The entity was offering an end to that suffering. But then I thought about all the families who'd lost fathers and husbands to black lung disease. All the communities that had been destroyed by mining accidents and lung disease. The entity wasn't offering salvation, when Helsav, it was offering to make the suffering eternal. "Some prices are too high to pay," I said, and pressed the detonator button. The explosions started at the far end of the chamber and worked their way toward the center. Massive support beams cracked and fell, bringing down millions of tons of rock. The dust figures screamed as the falling debris scattered their forms, and the coal mountain pulsed wildly as its connection to the outside tunnels was severed. I ran for the tunnel entrance as the chamber collapsed behind me. The entity's voice followed me, growing fainter with distance. "You cannot destroy us forever, Michael Cragwood. We are the coal itself, and as long as men dig coal from the earth, we will grow stronger." The tunnel was collapsing too, but I could see light ahead. Tony and Jim had found an emergency exit shaft. I dove through the opening just as the last of the main chamber supports gave way, sealing the black lung entity into its underground prison. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital recovering from coal dust inhalation. The doctors were amazed that I'd survived breathing such concentrated particles, and they warned me that my black lung disease would progress faster now. I had maybe 5 years instead of 10. But I was alive, and the Blackheart mine was sealed forever. The official report stated that the mine had suffered a catastrophic structural collapse due to geological instability. The bodies of the 14 miners were listed as victims of accidental suffocation caused by poor air quality in the abandoned mine. Nobody mentioned the moving coal dust or the voices in the tunnels. Tony and Jim backed up my story about the dangerous air quality and the need for an emergency demolition. But late at night, when we thought no one could hear us, we talked about what we'd really seen down there. Sheriff Patterson put up warning signs around the entire area and had the access road blocked off. The mine entrance was buried under tons of concrete and steel. As far as the state was concerned, the Blackheart mine no longer existed. But I knew better. 3 months after the collapse, I started hearing reports from other coal mining areas. Miners in West Virginia found unexplained coal dust formations in abandoned shafts. A crew in Pennsylvania discovered mining equipment that had been operating without any human operators. In Virginia, 5 retired miners with black lung disease disappeared from their homes and were found dead in a sealed mine, sitting in a perfect circle. The black lung entity wasn't gone. It was spreading. I became an unofficial consultant for the Mine Safety and Health Administration, investigating unusual incidents in coal mining regions across Appalachia. Most of the cases were normal accidents or equipment failures. But sometimes I found evidence of something more sinister. Moving coal dust. Mining sounds from empty tunnels. The voices of dead miners calling out to the living. The entity had kept its promise. As long as coal was dug from the earth, it would continue to grow stronger. Every miner who died from black lung disease was potential fuel for its expansion, and there were a lot of sick miners in Appalachia. I learned to recognize the signs: coal dust that moved against the wind, mining equipment that operated without electricity, and the distinctive cough of men whose lungs were being consumed from the inside out. When I found these signs, I did what I could to warn people away and seal off the affected areas. But I couldn't be everywhere at once. The worst part was knowing that the entity was probably right about one thing. Miners really were dying slowly and painfully from lung disease, and their families really were watching them waste away. The black lung offered them an escape from that suffering, even if the price was their humanity. Sometimes, late at night when my own coughing got bad, I wondered if I'd made the right choice in the mine. The coal dust in my lungs was getting thicker every month, and I knew that someday it would kill me. When that day came, would I have the strength to resist the entity's call? 6 months after Blackheart, I was investigating a case in eastern Kentucky when I met an old miner named Earl Thompson. He'd worked underground for 43 years and was dying of black lung disease. His oxygen tank barely kept him breathing, and every word was a struggle. "I heard about what happened at Blackheart," he wheezed. "About the choice that thing offers. Don't listen to it, Earl. Whatever it promises, it's not worth losing your soul." Earl looked at me with eyes that had seen too much suffering. "Easy for you to say, Ranger. You're not the one drowning in your own lungs." "I've got black lung too," I told him. "Every day is a choice to keep fighting or give up. But giving up means the coal companies win. It means every miner who died fighting for safer working conditions died for nothing." Earl thought about that for a long time. Finally, he nodded. "Maybe you're right. Maybe the real fight isn't against the dust in our lungs. Maybe it's for the miners who come after us." That's when I realized the truth about the black lung entity. It wasn't just feeding on the death of miners. It was feeding on their despair. Their belief that suffering was inevitable and escape was impossible. But miners had always been fighters. They'd organized unions, demanded safety equipment, and stood up to companies that treated them like disposable equipment. The entity wanted them to forget that fighting spirit and accept defeat. I started working with mining safety advocates and black lung support groups, helping families cope with the disease and fight for better medical treatment. Every miner who chose to keep fighting instead of giving up was a victory against the entity. It's been 2 years since Blackheart now. My black lung disease is getting worse, and I know I don't have much time left. But I also know that when my time comes, I won't be sitting in a circle in some abandoned mine, waiting for the black lung entity to take me. I'll be fighting to the very end, because that's what miners do. And someday, maybe that fighting spirit will be enough to send the black lung entity back to the depths where it belongs. Until then, I'll keep investigating the strange cases and warning people about the choices they'll have to make. Because in the coal mines of Appalachia, the dust never really settles, and neither do the souls of the men who refuse to let it win. My name is Eleanor Bramblethorne, and I've been protecting the forests of North Carolina for 12 years now. People think being a park ranger is all campfire talks and helping lost hikers, but the truth is, these mountains hold secrets that would make most folks pack up and never come back. I grew up in these hills. My grandmother taught me about plants before I could even read properly. She'd take me through the woods, showing me which berries were safe to eat and which leaves could heal a cut. By the time I got my PhD in botany, I already knew more about mountain plants than most professors. The old ways and the new science. That combination made me good at my job. Pisgah National Forest covers over 500,000 acres, and I know every trail around Looking Glass Rock like the back of my hand. The tourists come for the waterfalls and the views, but they don't see what I see. They don't notice when the patterns change, when plants grow where they shouldn't, when the forest gets too quiet. That September in 1987 started like any other autumn. The leaves were turning, painting the mountainsides in reds and golds that took your breath away. Perfect hiking weather. The kind of crisp, clear days that brought people from all over the state to walk our trails. I was checking the Looking Glass Rock Trail that Tuesday morning when I found the first body. The hiker was a young man, maybe 25, lying face down on the trail like he'd just decided to take a nap. But when I rolled him over, I knew something was very wrong. His lips were blue-black, and his fingernails had turned the same dark color. Foam had dried around his mouth, and his eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. I called it in on my radio and waited for the medical examiner. Dr. Martinez arrived 2 hours later with the county sheriff. While they worked, I walked the area, looking for clues. That's when I found the others. 7 hikers total, scattered along a 2-mile stretch of trail, all dead, all showing the same symptoms: the blue-black lips, the foam, the wide-open eyes filled with terror. Plant poisoning, Dr. Martinez told me after his initial examination. Multiple toxins, administered over several days. This wasn't accidental. I've studied poisonous plants my whole life. I know foxglove can stop your heart, and I know deathcap mushrooms can shut down your liver. But what I saw in those bodies didn't match any plant that grows in North Carolina. The toxin levels don't make sense, Dr. Martinez said, showing me his field test results. We've got compounds from plants that don't exist anywhere near here. Some of these toxins come from plants that grow in South America, others from Asia. It's impossible. That word, impossible, started ringing in my head as I walked the trail again that evening. The bodies had been removed, but I could still see the spots where they'd fallen, and that's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. New plants were growing. Right there on the trail, in the exact spots where the hikers had died, I found seedlings I'd never seen before. They looked like tiny versions of the plants that had killed those people. Plants that shouldn't exist anywhere on this continent. I knelt down and took samples, careful not to touch them with my bare hands. The little plants seemed to pulse in the fading light, their leaves a sickly green color that hurt to look at. My grandmother used to tell stories about the mountain witches. Women who knew the old plant magic, who could make anything grow anywhere. Just stories. I always told myself. Folk explanations for things people didn't understand back then. But as I bagged those impossible seedlings, her voice echoed in my memory. Some women became so powerful, they stopped being women at all. They became part of the mountain itself, part of the roots and soil. And when they're hungry, they harvest what they need. I stood up, samples in hand, and looked around at the darkening forest. For the first time in 12 years of walking these trails, I felt like I was being watched. The trees creaked in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, I heard what sounded like laughter. But it might have been just the wind. The lab results came back 3 days later, and they changed everything I thought I knew about the natural world. Eleanor, you need to see this. Dr. Martinez called me at the ranger station. Those plant samples you brought in, they're not in any database. Not just unknown species, but unknown families. The genetic structure doesn't match anything we've ever cataloged. I drove to his lab in Asheville, my stomach tight with worry. The samples sat in sealed containers under bright lights, but they'd grown since I'd collected them. A lot. Look at this growth rate, Doctor, Martinez said, pointing to his measurements. 3 days ago, these were tiny seedlings. Now they're almost mature plants. That's physically impossible. Plants don't grow that fast. I stared at the specimens. They developed flowers. Beautiful, perfect flowers that seemed to glow with their own light. Despite everything, I felt drawn to them. They were the most gorgeous plants I'd ever seen. "Don't get too close," Dr. Martinez warned. "The pollen tests positive for at least 6 different neurotoxins. Just breathing near these things could kill you." That's when I knew we were dealing with something beyond normal science. I spent the next 2 days researching everything I could find about plant anomalies, genetic mutations, anything that might explain what we'd discovered. But deep down, I kept thinking about my grandmother's stories. On Saturday morning, I decided to hike the Looking Glass Rock Trail again. I needed to see the site where we'd found the bodies, needed to understand what was happening in my forest. The trail felt different, wrong somehow. The normal sounds of birds and insects were missing, replaced by an odd silence that made my footsteps seem too loud. The air itself felt thick, like breathing through wet cloth. I reached the first death site around noon. The seedlings I'd found were gone, but the ground where they'd grown looked burned, as if something had sucked all life from the soil. I knelt to examine the dead earth when I heard footsteps behind me. "Man? Excuse me, man?" I turned to see a couple in their 40s, both wearing expensive hiking gear and looking lost. The woman was pale and sweating despite the cool mountain air. "We're looking for the waterfall trail," the man said. "We've been walking for hours, but we keep ending up back here." That was strange. The waterfall trail was clearly marked, and you couldn't get lost on it if you tried. But looking at these two, I could see something was wrong. The woman's pupils were dilated, and both of them had a glassy look in their eyes. "How long have you been hiking today?" I asked. "Since dawn," the woman said, her voice slurred. "But we keep forgetting which way we came from." I checked my watch. It was past noon. They'd been walking for at least 6 hours on what should have been a 2-hour hike. And they looked like they were getting sick. "We need to get you two off this mountain," I said. "Right now." But as I led them back toward the parking area, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Everywhere their feet had touched the trail, tiny green shoots were pushing up through the dirt. New plants, growing in real time, following their footsteps like a sickly green trail. The woman collapsed about halfway to the parking lot. Her husband caught her, but he was swaying too, barely able to stand. "What's happening to us?" he whispered. I called for emergency medical help, but I knew they might not make it. Whatever was affecting them was working fast. Too fast. While we waited for the ambulance, I noticed more plants growing around us. Not just where the couple had walked, but everywhere. The forest floor was coming alive with new growth, and all of it looked wrong. Twisted vines, flowers with too many petals, leaves that seemed to move on their own. The ambulance arrived just as the woman stopped breathing. The paramedics worked on her while I helped her husband into the vehicle. But I could see in their faces that they didn't understand what they were dealing with. Same symptoms as the other victims. One paramedic told me quietly, "Multiple plant toxins, but we can't identify the source." As the ambulance drove away, I stood alone on the trail, surrounded by the impossible new growth. The plants seemed to be watching me, and for the first time since becoming a ranger, I was genuinely afraid of my own forest. That's when I heard it, a sound like wind through leaves. But there was no wind. It sounded almost like whispering, like voices calling from deep in the earth. I ran back to my truck, not caring how that looked. Some things in these mountains were older and more dangerous than anything I'd learned in school. And I was starting to think my grandmother's stories weren't stories at all. They were warnings. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those impossible plants growing from the footsteps of dying hikers. By morning, I'd made a decision that probably saved my life. I was going to approach this like the scientist I was trained to be, even if the science didn't make sense. I loaded my truck with every piece of equipment I could find: soil analysis kits, air quality monitors, ground-penetrating radar, and enough protective gear to handle a chemical spill. If something was poisoning people through plants, I was going to find out how. The Looking Glass Rock Trail was closed to hikers now, yellow tape stretched across the entrance. I ducked under it and headed into the forest, my equipment pack heavy on my shoulders. The changes hit me immediately. In just 3 days, the forest had transformed. Vines thick as my arm hung from trees that shouldn't have been able to support them. Flowers bloomed in impossible colors, deep purple roses growing next to bright orange mushrooms, neither of which belonged in these mountains. My air quality monitor started beeping within the first 100 yards. The readings showed toxin levels that should have killed me instantly, but I felt fine. My protective mask was working, but it raised a terrifying question. How were these toxins getting into the air? I set up my first monitoring station where we'd found the original victims. The ground-penetrating radar revealed something that made me check the readings 3 times to be sure. Root systems. Massive root systems, connecting trees that were hundreds of yards apart. The radar showed a network of underground growth that stretched for miles, all of it centered on this section of trail. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the roots were moving. I watched the radar screen as thick underground tendrils shifted and grew, reaching toward my equipment like fingers exploring something new. Whatever was down there was aware of my presence. I moved deeper into the forest, setting up monitoring stations every quarter mile. The plant growth got stranger with each step. I found trees that had grown into impossible shapes overnight, oaks twisted into spirals, pines that branched in perfect geometric patterns, maples whose leaves had turned colors that don't exist in nature. At the 3rd station, I discovered something that changed everything I thought I knew about plants. I was taking soil samples when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. One of the twisted oak trees was shifting, its branches slowly reaching toward me. Not swaying in the wind, there was no wind, moving with purpose. I backed away, but other trees began moving too. Branches stretched toward me from all directions, and I realized I was being surrounded. That's when I heard the voice. Eleanor Bramblethorn. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The voice of a woman, old and tired and hungry. You have the blood, you understand the old ways. The branches stopped moving, hovering just inches from my body. I could smell something sweet and sickly, like flowers left too long in a vase. Who are you? I whispered. I am what your grandmother feared to become. I am what happens when the mountain claims its own. The ground beneath my feet began to shift. Roots erupted from the soil, thick as pythons, wrapping around my ankles. They didn't hurt me, but they held me in place while that ancient voice continued. You know me, child. Your grandmother told you stories of the root mother, the woman who learned to speak with plants, who gave herself to the mountain to gain power over all growing things. My great-great-grandmother Sarah. The family story said she disappeared into the mountains over a century ago, but we'd always assumed she'd died in an accident. Now I understood the truth was much worse. The people who died here, I said. You killed them. I harvested them, the voice corrected. Just as I harvest all who walk my domain. Their deaths feed the soil, and their memories become part of the network. Every person who dies here adds to my knowledge, to my power. The roots tightened around my legs, not painful but impossible to break. Around me, the trees continued their slow dance, branches reaching and retreating like the tentacles of some massive creature. But you are different, Eleanor. You carry my blood. You understand plants in ways others cannot. Join me willingly, and I will teach you secrets that science cannot imagine. I looked around at the transformed forest, at the impossible plants and the moving trees. Part of me was terrified. But another part, the part that had always felt more at home in the forest than anywhere else, was tempted. What would I become? I asked. What I became. Part of the mountain itself. Immortal, all-knowing. Every root and leaf and flower would be extension of your will. And the people, the hikers? Food for the forest. The mountain must eat, child. It has always eaten. I simply choose the menu now. That's when I knew I had to fight. Whatever my great-great-grandmother had become, she was no longer human. She was something that saw people as nothing more than fertilizer for her garden. I reached into my pack and pulled out the emergency flare I always carried. If these plants were as toxic as my readings suggested, fire might be the only thing that could stop them. You would burn your own heritage? The voice asked, and I could hear amusement in it. I would protect innocent people, I said, and lit the flare. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Every plant in sight recoiled from the flame like living things in pain. The roots around my ankles released me so quickly I stumbled backward. But then the real horror began. The forest started screaming. The sound that came from the trees was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Part wind, part animal cry, part human scream. It rose from every leaf and branch around me, a chorus of pain and rage that made my ears ring. I ran, clutching the burning flare, as the forest came alive with malevolent purpose. Branches whipped toward me like striking snakes. Roots erupted from the ground, trying to trip me. Flowers burst open, releasing clouds of toxic pollen that burned my eyes even through my protective mask. But the fire kept them back. Whatever the root mother had become, she still feared the flame. I reached my truck and threw my equipment into the back, my hands shaking as I started the engine. In the rearview mirror, I could see the forest moving, trees bending and swaying as if in a hurricane, though the air was perfectly still. I drove straight to the ranger station and called every authority I could think of: fire department, state police, the Forest Service headquarters. I told them we had a biological contamination that required immediate evacuation and quarantine of the entire Looking Glass Rock area. Most of them thought I was having a breakdown. 12 years of faithful service, and they thought the stress had finally gotten to me. But the toxicology reports from the dead hikers were enough to get the area closed and a hazmat team dispatched. That night, I went through my grandmother's old journals, looking for anything that might help me understand what I was fighting. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. My family had been dealing with the root mother for generations. Every few decades, she would wake from dormancy and begin hunting again. My grandmother had managed to contain her the last time, in 1952, using a combination of herbicides and controlled burns. But it was only temporary. She grows stronger each time. My grandmother had written, "The network spreads, more roots, more connections. One day, she will reach beyond this mountain, and then, God help us all." I found detailed drawings of the root mother's true form, not the human she had once been, but the thing she had become. A massive organism that lived mostly underground, her body transformed into a network of roots and fungal connections that stretched for miles beneath the forest. What I'd seen moving the trees was just the smallest part of her. The drawings showed her core, a central mass, deep underground where her original human consciousness still resided, merged with thousands of plant species into something that was no longer recognizably alive in any normal sense. I also found the recipe for the herbicide mixture my grandmother had used. It wouldn't kill the root mother, but it might force her back into dormancy for another generation. The problem was, I would have to get close enough to pour it directly onto her core. And according to the drawings, that core was buried 50 feet underground in a cavern system that didn't appear on any official maps. I spent the next day preparing. If the authorities wouldn't listen to me, I'd have to handle this myself. I mixed my grandmother's herbicide formula, loaded my truck with rope and climbing gear, and said goodbye to my cat in case I didn't come home. The hazmat team had cordoned off a much larger area by then, but I knew the back trails well enough to avoid their checkpoint. As I hiked toward the center of the contamination zone, the changes in the forest became even more dramatic. Trees had grown together, their trunks fusing into living walls. Vines formed bridges between the canopy, creating a green ceiling that blocked out most of the sky. And everywhere, the impossible flowers bloomed, filling the air with their sickly sweet perfume. I found the entrance to the cave system where my grandmother's map said it would be, a crack in the rock face that looked natural but opened into darkness deeper than my flashlight could penetrate. "You've come home at last," the root mother's voice whispered from the depths. I tied my rope to a solid tree and began the descent. The cave walls were lined with roots, some thin as hair, others thick as telephone poles. They pulsed with a rhythm that reminded me of a heartbeat, and they glowed with a faint bioluminescence that cast everything in an eerie green light. 50 feet down, the cave opened into a vast underground chamber. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. The root mother's core was a massive, pulsing mass that filled most of the cavern floor. Part plant, part fungus, part something that had no name, it breathed and moved like a living thing. And embedded throughout its surface, I could see human skulls and bones, the remains of everyone she had consumed over the past century. At the center of the mass, barely recognizable as human, was a face, my great-great-grandmother's face, preserved in living wood and vine, her eyes open and aware. "Welcome, child," she said, her voice coming from the walls themselves. "You see me as I truly am now. Beautiful, isn't it?" I unslung my pack and pulled out the herbicide mixture. It was concentrated acid mixed with specific plant toxins that my grandmother had discovered could disrupt the root mother's cellular structure. "You would poison your own blood?" she asked, and I heard genuine hurt in her voice. "You're not my blood anymore," I said. You're something else, something that needs to be stopped. I offer you immortality, knowledge beyond anything your science can provide, the power to speak with every living plant on this continent, and you choose death instead? I choose humanity, I said, and began pouring the mixture onto her core. The effect was immediate and terrible. The root mother's scream shook the entire mountain. The mass began to convulse and smoke, its bioluminescent glow flickering like a dying bulb. You don't understand, she cried. There are others, other root mothers, sleeping beneath other mountains. Without me to keep them dormant, they will wake, they will spread. I kept pouring, even as the chamber began to collapse around me. Rocks fell from the ceiling as the root mother's death throes shook the cave system. You have doomed them all, she screamed, and then her voice cut off abruptly. The mass stopped moving, the glow faded. In the sudden silence, I could hear water dripping and my own ragged breathing. I climbed out of that cave as fast as I could, my rope burning through my gloves. Behind me, I could hear the mountains settling as the root mother's network died, releasing its hold on the forest. By the time I reached the surface, it was over. The impossible. Plants were withering, turning brown and crumbling to dust. The trees had stopped moving. The air, when I removed my mask, smelled clean again. But her final words echoed in my mind. There are others. The official report blamed the deaths on a rare fungal outbreak that produced hallucinogenic toxins. The CDC quarantined the area for 6 months, while the forest slowly returned to normal. By the following spring, you'd never know anything unusual had happened there. But I know better. I kept my grandmother's journals and added my own observations. The root mother is dead, but she was right about one thing. There are others. I've found references to similar incidents throughout Appalachian history. Hikers disappearing in groups. Unexplained plant growth. Stories of mountain witches that sound too familiar for comfort. The worst part is what happened to me. 3 months after the cave, I discovered I could feel the forest in a way I never had before. When I walk the trails now, I sense things through the root networks. Where animals have passed, where the soil is rich or poor, where other plants are stressed or thriving. It's like having a conversation with the entire ecosystem. I think some of the root mother's essence got into me during our final confrontation. Not enough to transform me like it did her, but enough to change me in fundamental ways. I'm more connected to the plants now, and they respond to me differently. Sometimes I catch myself wondering what it would be like to go further, to sink my own roots into the mountain soil and become something more than human. On my darkest days, I understand the temptation that corrupted my great-great-grandmother. But I also remember the skulls in that cavern, and the terror in those hikers' eyes. I've been reassigned to monitor the entire Appalachian region now, officially looking for invasive species, but really watching for signs of the other root mothers. The authorities don't know why. I requested the transfer, but they approved it based on my expertise with the fungal outbreak. Last month, I found suspicious plant growth near Mount Mitchell. The month before that, strange toxins showed up in soil samples from the Smokies. Each time, I've managed to catch the problem early, before any hikers died. I carry my grandmother's herbicide formula with me always now, along with emergency flares and climbing gear. Because I know this isn't over. There are other mountains, other caves, other women who gave themselves to the earth and became something hungry. Sometimes, late at night in my cabin, I can feel them stirring. Ancient minds connected through networks of root and fungus, dreaming beneath the mountains, waiting for their time to wake and harvest. My name is Eleanor Bramblethorne, and I guard the forests of Appalachia. Most people think being a park ranger is about helping lost hikers and preventing forest fires. They have no idea how wrong they are. The mountains are full of things older than human civilization, and some of them remember when we were nothing more than prey. My job isn't just to protect people from the wilderness. I have not Trestian, it's to protect them from the things in the wilderness that see them as food. I've learned to live with the knowledge that beneath my feet, connected by root systems that span hundreds of miles, ancient minds plot and plan and wait for their chance to feed again. And I've accepted that as long as I draw breath, I'll be the one standing between them and the innocent people who just want to enjoy a peaceful hike in the mountains. It's not the career I planned, but it's the one my bloodline prepared me for. And every morning, when I lace up my boots and head out into the forest, I carry the weight of knowing that somewhere in these mountains, something is stirring in its sleep, dreaming of the taste of human fear. The harvest never really ends. It just waits for a new season to begin. My name is Samuel Thornwick, and I've been a park ranger at Jefferson National Forest for 17 years. People think my job is all about helping lost hikers and fighting forest fires, but the truth is, I spend most of my time dealing with people who think the woods are their personal playground. Drug labs, illegal hunting, folks dumping trash where they shouldn't. After nearly 2 decades of this work, I thought I'd seen everything the mountains could throw at me. I was wrong. Before I became a ranger, I studied at seminary school for 3 years. Wanted to be a preacher, just like my daddy and his daddy before him. But the more I learned about religion, the more questions I had that nobody could answer. So I left the church and came to the mountains instead. Out here, God felt more real than in any building with a steeple. My badge says, Law Enforcement Specialist, which means when something bad happens in these woods, I'm usually the first one they call. I've got training in criminal investigation, search and rescue, and crisis management. I know how to read tracks, how to spot when someone's lying, and how to tell the difference between animal attacks and human violence. That's why they called me on October 15th, 1993, when they found the church. The call came in just after sunrise. Sheriff's Department got a report from a hunting party who'd been camping near Mount Rogers. They'd seen lights in the old Redemption Baptist Church and went to check it out, thinking maybe some kids were causing trouble. What they found instead made 2 grown men throw up and run back to their truck. I knew that church. Every ranger in the area did. It had been abandoned since 1962, when the last of the congregation died off or moved away. The building sat about 5 miles up a logging road that barely counted as a trail anymore. No electricity, no heat, roof half caved in. We checked on it maybe once a year, just to make sure nobody was squatting or using it for drug business. The hunters described what they'd seen in shaky voices. 47 people sitting in the pews like they were waiting for Sunday service to start. All of them dead. All of them perfectly arranged. Hands folded, eyes closed, facing forward toward the altar. No blood, no signs of struggle, no obvious cause of death. I loaded my truck with crime scene tape, my camera, and enough gear to spend the day up there. The drive to the church took 40 minutes on roads that kept getting worse the higher I climbed. Fall was hitting hard that year, and the trees were already bare. Everything looked gray and dead, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. When I finally saw the church through the trees, my first thought was that the hunters had been mistaken about it being abandoned. The building looked better than it should have. The roof seemed solid, the walls straight. Paint that I remembered being peeled and faded now looked fresh. Even the little bell tower, which had been leaning like it might fall over, stood straight and proud. But when I got closer, I could see it was still the same broken-down building I'd always known. The good condition was just a trick of the morning light, or maybe my eyes playing games after the long drive up the mountain. The front door was standing wide open. I called out before I went inside. Standard procedure. Park Service, anyone in there? My voice echoed in the silence, but nobody answered. I stepped through the doorway and immediately felt something wrong. The air inside was warm, not just warm, comfortable, like someone had been running a heater all night. But there was no heater, no electrical lines, no propane tanks. Just 47 dead people sitting in wooden pews like they'd been there since Sunday morning. I've seen plenty of dead bodies in my time. Hikers who fell off cliffs, hunters who had heart attacks, kids who overdosed in the woods. Death has a smell, a feeling, a way of making everything around it feel heavy and sad. This didn't feel like death. It felt like waiting. I spent the next hour walking through that church, taking pictures and notes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The FBI was already on their way. Anytime you get this many unexplained deaths, the federal boys want to take a look. But until they arrived, the scene was mine to process. Every single person was dressed in their Sunday best. Nice clothes, clean shoes, hair combed neat, men in suits, women in dresses, even a few kids in their church outfits. Their faces looked peaceful, like they'd just closed their eyes to pray and never opened them again. I checked for identification on the first few bodies. Driver's licenses from Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, even one from as far away as Georgia. none of them local. These weren't people who'd just wandered up from the valley. They'd traveled here, some of them hundreds of miles. The strangest thing was how they were arranged. Not just sitting in the pews, but positioned like they were part of a real church service. Someone had placed hymnals in their hands, open to the same page. Their heads were tilted at the exact same angle, like they were all listening to the same sermon. But there was no preacher at the altar. I was photographing the front row when I noticed the temperature change. The warm air I'd felt when I first walked in was getting warmer. Not uncomfortably hot, just inviting. Like coming inside on a cold day and sitting by a fire. That's when I heard the music. Just for a second, so quiet I almost missed it. Organ music, the kind you hear in old churches during hymns. I stopped moving and held my breath, listening. Nothing, just the wind outside and the creak of old wood settling. I checked my watch. The FBI team wasn't due for another hour. I decided to search the building more thoroughly. The church was bigger inside than it looked from outside. That sounds crazy, but I'm telling you what I saw. The main area where all the bodies sat was normal-sized, but when I walked toward the back, the hallway seemed to stretch longer than it should have. There were rooms I didn't remember from my previous visits. A kitchen, some kind of office, a storage area full of old church supplies. In the office, I found something that made my skin crawl. A stack of handwritten papers on the desk, like someone had been preparing for a sermon. The handwriting was neat and careful, but the words were wrong. Bible verses I recognized from my seminary days, but changed. Twisted around to mean the opposite of what they should mean. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall inherit damnation. Love your enemies, that you may destroy them utterly. Suffer the little children to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of darkness. I'd seen plenty of weird stuff in these mountains. Satanist graffiti, occult symbols carved into trees, the usual nonsense that troubled kids get up to when they want to shock their parents. But this felt different. This felt like someone who really knew the Bible had sat down and carefully, methodically, corrupted every word. At the bottom of the last page, in the same neat handwriting, tonight's service begins at midnight. All are welcome, all are called. I checked my watch again. It was just past noon. The FBI team arrived 30 minutes later, Agent Sarah Chen and Agent Marcus Webb, both out of the Richmond office. They were professional and thorough, turning my crime scene into their crime scene with the efficiency that comes from handling weird cases all across Virginia. Agent Chen interviewed me, while Agent Webb started processing the bodies. Standard questions. When did I arrive? What had I touched? What had I observed? I told them everything except the strange feeling about the building's size and the warmth in the air. Those details sounded crazy even to me. Any idea how 47 people from different states ended up in an abandoned church in the middle of nowhere? Chen asked. No, ma'am. This place has been empty for 30 years. No road access except that logging trail, no utilities, no reason for anyone to come here. But you've been here before? Annual safety checks. Building's been falling apart for as long as I've known it. Surprised it's still standing, to be honest. Agent Webb called out from the front of the church. Chen, you need to see this. We walked over to where he was kneeling next to one of the bodies in the front row. An older woman, maybe 60, wearing a blue dress and pearl earrings. Look at her hands, Webb said. The woman's hands were folded in her lap, holding a hymnal open to page 237. But her fingers weren't just resting on the book. They were gripping it tight enough that her knuckles had gone white, like she'd been holding on for dear life. Chen checked the other bodies. Same thing. Every single person was clutching their hymnal like it was the only thing keeping them anchored to the world. What's on page 237? I asked. Chen flipped through one of the hymnals. Amazing Grace. But when I looked over her shoulder at the page, the words weren't right. Just like the sermon notes I'd found in the office, someone had changed the hymn. The melody was the same, but the words were all wrong. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was found, but now am lost. Was bound, but now I'm free. We spent the rest of the day documenting everything, bagging evidence, and arranging for the bodies to be transported to the medical examiner. As the sun started setting, the FBI team packed up their gear and headed back down the mountain. You coming with us, Ranger? Chen asked. I looked back at the church. In the fading light, it looked different again. Older. More broken down. like the daytime illusion of good repair was, fading with the sun. I'll stay a while longer. Make sure nobody disturbs the scene overnight. Chen nodded and handed me her card. Call if anything else turns up. And Ranger? Lock your doors tonight. After they left, I sat in my truck and watched the church as darkness fell. I should have driven home. Should have filed my report and let the federal boys handle whatever weirdness was going on up here. Instead, I found myself thinking about those sermon notes. About the hymnal with the wrong words. About 47 people who'd traveled hundreds of miles to die in an abandoned church. And about that invitation written at the bottom of the page. Tonight's service begins at midnight. I should have left. Every instinct I had as a law enforcement officer told me to get in my truck and drive back down that mountain. But something kept me there, sitting in the darkness, watching that empty church. At 11:30, I saw the first light. Just a flicker at first, like someone had lit a candle inside. Then, more lights, until every window in the building was glowing with warm, yellow light. The kind of light you get from oil lamps or old-fashioned electrical bulbs. But there was no power running to that building. Hadn't been for 30 years. I grabbed my flashlight and my radio, though I knew I was too far up the mountain to reach anyone. The smart thing would have been to drive down until I could get a signal and call for backup. Instead, I found myself walking toward that church, like I was being pulled by an invisible rope. The front door was closed now, but I could hear something from inside. Voices. People singing, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. But it was the wrong version, the twisted words I'd seen in the hymnal. Dozens of voices singing together, harmonizing like they'd been practicing for years. I tried the door handle. Locked. I walked around the building, checking the windows. They were all too high to see, through clearly, but I could make out shapes moving inside, people standing, sitting, moving around like they were following some kind of church service. But all the people were dead. I'd seen their bodies. The FBI had taken them away hours ago. My radio crackled with static. For just a second, I thought I heard a voice trying to come through, but then it went quiet again. That's when I noticed my truck was gone. I ran back to where I'd parked it, but there was nothing there except tire tracks in the dirt. Like someone had driven it away while I was walking around the church. But I had the keys in my pocket, and I hadn't heard an engine start. The singing from inside the church got louder. I was trapped on the mountain with no radio, no vehicle, and whatever was happening inside that building. The smart thing would have been to start walking down the logging road, try to reach the main highway on foot. It was only 5 miles, maybe 6. I could make it by dawn if I didn't stop. Instead, I found myself walking back to the church. Back to those windows full of impossible light and those voices singing hymns with words that made my seminary training crawl up my spine and whisper warnings. I found a spot where I could boost myself up and look through one of the side windows. The church was full of people. Not the same people I'd found that morning. These folks were alive, moving around, singing along with whoever was leading the service. Men and women and children, all dressed in their Sunday clothes, all looking like they belonged in any church in any small town across the South, except for their eyes. Even from outside, I could see their eyes were wrong. Not the color or the shape, but the expression. They looked hungry, like they were waiting for something wonderful to happen, something they'd been waiting for their whole lives. At the front of the church, behind the altar, stood a man I'd never seen before. Tall and thin, wearing a black suit that looked like it came from another century. His hair was perfectly combed, his face was clean-shaven, and when he smiled at his congregation, I felt my blood turn cold. He was preaching, but I couldn't make out the words through the window. Whatever he was saying, the people loved it. They nodded and said, "Amen," and looked at him like he was the most important person in the world. Then he looked directly at me. Through the window, through the darkness, like he'd known I was there the whole time. His smile got wider, and he raised one hand and pointed right at me. Every person in that church turned to look at the window where I was standing. I dropped down and ran. I made it maybe 50 yards before I realized I wasn't running away from the church. I was running toward the front door. My legs were carrying me there, like they had a mind of their own, like something was calling me home after a long time away. The door was open now. Light spilled out onto the ground in front of the building, warm and welcoming. I could hear the preacher's voice clearly now, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. "Welcome, brothers and sisters, to tonight's service. We've been waiting for you." I knew I should run. Every rational part of my mind was screaming at me to get away from that place. But my seminary training was singing a different song. This was a church. These were people gathered for worship. This was where I belonged. I walked through that door like I was coming home. The inside of the church was exactly like it had been that morning, except now it was full of living people instead of dead ones. The same pews, the same altar, the same hymnal holders. But everything looked newer, cleaner, like the building had been restored to the way it looked when it was first built. The preacher stood at the front, his arms spread wide in welcome. "Brother Samuel," he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the church without him raising it. "We've been expecting you." "How do you know my name?" "I know all my congregation, son. I know where you've been and where you're going. I know about the questions that drove you from seminary, the doubts that brought you to these mountains. Sit down. Let me give you the answers you've been looking for." There was an empty spot in the front pew, like it had been saved just for me. I started walking toward it, past all those people with their hungry eyes and their perfect Sunday clothes. But something stopped me halfway down the aisle. The smell. Under the warm air and the candlelight and the feeling of coming home, there was something else, something wrong. It took me a second to place it, but then I knew. It was the smell of meat that had been left out too long, the smell of things rotting in the heat. I looked more carefully at the people around me. Their clothes were perfect, their hair was combed neat, their faces were clean. But their skin had a gray tint to it, like they hadn't seen sunlight in a very long time. And when they smiled at me, their teeth looked too sharp. "Sit down, Brother Samuel," the preacher said again. "Service is about to begin." "What kind of service?" I asked. His smile got wider. "The kind you've been preparing for your whole life." I didn't sit down. Every instinct I had left was telling me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The congregation was still looking at me, still smiling with those two sharp teeth, still waiting for me to take my place in the front pew. "You're scared," the preacher said, and his voice was kind and understanding. "That's natural, son. Fear is just faith that hasn't found its proper direction yet. What happened to the people I found this morning, the 47 bodies? They found what they were looking for." He gestured to the congregation around me. "Just like all these good folks have. Just like you will, once you stop fighting what you know is right." I looked around the church again, really looked this time. The people in the pews weren't just gray-skinned and wrong-eyed. They were transparent. I could see through them to the wooden backs of the pews, like they were made of fog or smoke shaped into human form. "You're dead," I said. "All of you." "Death is just a word people use when they don't understand transformation," the preacher replied. "These good folks have moved beyond the limitations of flesh and bone. They've found true faith, Brother Samuel, the kind that lasts forever." "What are you?" For just a second, his perfect smile slipped. Behind it, I saw something that wasn't human at all. Something that might have been human once, a long time ago, but had been changed into something else. Something hungry. "I'm what you might call a traveling preacher," he said. "I go from church to church, congregation to congregation, sharing the good news. And the good news is this: there's no need to wait for the afterlife to begin. We can start your eternal service right here, right now." The congregation laughed, and the sound was like wind blowing through a graveyard. I tried to back toward the door, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like they'd grown roots into the floorboards. "You studied for the ministry," the preacher continued. "You know what real faith looks like. It requires sacrifice. It requires surrender. It requires letting go of everything that ties you to this temporary, painful world. And if I refuse, oh, son," he shook his head sadly, "there's no refusing. You're here because you were called. Just like all these good folks were called. Just like everyone who's ever found their way to one of my services. The only choice you have is whether you come willing or whether I have to help you along." That's when I remembered something from seminary, something about demons and possession and the kinds of evil that prey on people's faith. "You can't make me," I said. "Free will. That's part of the rules, isn't it? Even devils have to follow some rules." His smile came back, bigger than ever. "Very good, Brother Samuel. Your theological education wasn't wasted after all. You're absolutely right. I can't force you to join my congregation." He paused, and the silence in the church became so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. But I can make you want to. The church around me began to change. The walls stretched up and up until they disappeared into darkness above. The pews multiplied, filling with more and more transparent people, hundreds of them, thousands, all looking at me with those hungry eyes. The altar grew larger and more elaborate, covered with golden candlesticks and silk cloth and things that might have been religious symbols if you looked at them quickly. And the preacher became something else entirely. He was still tall and thin, still wearing that black suit, but now I could see what he really was underneath. Something that had never been human, something that had been pretending to be human for so long it had almost forgotten what it really looked like. His face was too long, his arms too thin, his fingers too sharp. When he smiled, I could see rows and rows of teeth like a shark's mouth. "Do you know what faith really is, Brother Samuel?" he asked, and his voice came from everywhere at once. "It's the willingness to believe in something greater than yourself, something powerful enough to give your life meaning, something worth dying for." "And you think that's you?" "I know it's me. I've been collecting congregations for 200 years, son, building the greatest church the world has ever seen. Every soul that joins my service makes me stronger, makes my message clearer, makes my call more irresistible. And what's your message? That suffering is optional. That death is optional. That all the pain and fear and loneliness that fills up human life can end right here, right now, if you just have faith enough to let it go." He was right, and that was the worst part. Looking around at those thousands of transparent faces, I could see peace there. No more worry, no more doubt, no more late nights lying awake wondering if any of it meant anything. Just eternal service, eternal purpose, eternal belonging. It would be so easy to say yes. "The people I found this morning," I said, "they weren't the first, were they?" "Oh, no. I've been holding services in abandoned churches all across these mountains for decades. Sometimes I get a dozen souls, sometimes 50. Depends on how far my call reaches, how many people are ready to hear it. And you just leave the bodies there? For people like me to find? The flesh is just a shell, son. Once the spirit joins my congregation, what's left behind doesn't matter." He gestured to the ghostly people surrounding us. "These good folks are more alive now than they ever were when they were breathing." I thought about the FBI agents, about Agent Chen's business card in my pocket, about the life I'd built for myself in these mountains, about the questions that had driven me from seminary and the doubts that had brought me here. "What if I don't want answers anymore?" I asked. "What if I'm okay with the questions?" For the first time since I'd entered the church, the preacher looked genuinely surprised. "Everyone wants answers, Brother Samuel. That's what makes humans so beautifully predictable." "Maybe. But some questions are more important than their answers." I closed my eyes and thought about everything I'd learned in seminary, everything I'd forgotten, everything I'd chosen to leave behind when I came to the mountains. And then I started to pray. Not to the thing standing at the altar, not to any particular god or denomination or theological system, just to whatever force in the universe might be, listening. Whatever power might be willing to help one confused ranger who'd stumbled into something way over his head. The preacher laughed. "Prayer? Really? That's your plan?" But something was happening to the church around us. The walls were shrinking back to their normal size. The endless rows of pews were fading away. The golden altar was becoming plain wood again. "How?" the preacher demanded, and for the first time his voice sounded uncertain. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think you can only hold congregations in places where faith has died. And there's still faith in this place. Not your kind, but the real kind. The kind that doesn't need answers." The ghostly congregation was fading now, their forms becoming thinner and thinner until they were just suggestions in the air. The preacher himself was losing his solid appearance, becoming transparent like his followers. "This isn't over," he said as he dissolved. "There are other churches, other congregations waiting to be gathered. I'll find you again, Brother Samuel. Eventually, everyone comes to one of my services." "Maybe," I said, "but not tonight." I woke up the next morning on the floor of the church, alone. Sunlight was coming through the windows, and everything looked normal again. Old wooden pews, simple altar, no sign of the supernatural congregation I'd seen the night before. My truck was parked outside where I'd left it. I spent an hour walking through the building, looking for any evidence of what had happened. No golden candlesticks, no twisted hymnals, no sermon notes with corrupted Bible verses. Just an abandoned church that had been empty for 30 years. But when I got to the office in the back, I found something that made me stop cold. A guest book, sitting open on the desk. Page after page of signatures, people signing in for Sunday services. The dates went back decades: 1970, 1965, 1950, even some from the 1922. Hundreds of names, all written in the same careful handwriting. The last entry was from the night before. Samuel Thornwick, visitor. I ripped that page out of the book and burned it in the parking lot. The FBI closed their investigation a week later. Officially, the 47 people had died of some kind of mass poisoning, probably from contaminated food they'd shared at a religious gathering. The fact that no traces of poison showed up in their blood work was chalked up to the limited testing capabilities of the Mountain Medical Examiner's office. Agent Chen called me to let me know. "Weird case," she said. "But we've seen stranger things. Religious groups can convince people to do almost anything if they believe strongly enough." "What about the church itself? You going to keep it under surveillance?" "Not our jurisdiction anymore. It's just an old building, Ranger. Nothing federal about it. But I kept an eye on it. Made excuses to drive up that logging road once a week, just to check. Most of the time it looked like it always had, abandoned, falling apart, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But sometimes, on certain nights when the moon was dark and the wind was still, I'd see lights in the windows again. I never stopped the truck on those nights. Never got out to investigate. I'd learned my lesson about curiosity and abandoned churches and preachers who collect congregations like other people collect stamps. But I started paying attention to missing person reports from across the region. People who disappeared without explanation, usually after telling family members they'd been called to attend a special church service. Most of them turned up eventually, their bodies found in remote locations, arranged like they died peacefully in their sleep. Always in groups of 40 to 50. Always looking like they'd died happy. I tried talking to other law enforcement agencies about the pattern, but nobody wanted to hear about demonic preachers and supernatural congregations. They had enough real crimes to worry about without chasing ghost stories, so I keep track myself. I've got a map in my office with pins marking every incident that fits the pattern. Abandoned churches across Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, even a few in Kentucky and West Virginia. Places where faith used to live but doesn't anymore. Perfect venues for someone like the preacher to hold his services. The pins form a rough circle, with the Redemption Baptist Church right in the center. I still work as a ranger. Still do my job, protect the forest, help lost hikers find their way home. But I've changed since that night. I can sense things now that I couldn't before. When I walk into a church, any church, I can tell whether it's really sacred or whether it's just a building where people go through the motions. Most of them are just buildings now. Whatever makes a place truly holy has been fading from the world for a long time, leaving behind empty spaces that something else can fill. I think about that sometimes, when I'm alone on night patrol in the mountains, about faith and doubt and the questions that don't have answers, about the choice between comforting lies and difficult truths, about how easy it would be to just stop fighting and let someone else handle the big decisions. The preacher was right about one thing: everyone comes to one of his services eventually. When the weight of being human gets too heavy, when the questions become too hard, when the loneliness becomes too much to bear, his call gets stronger and harder to resist. But knowing that, understanding the temptation, makes it easier to fight. Most days, sometimes, when I'm driving past that old church and I see the lights in the windows, I have to pull over and sit in my truck for a while. Take deep breaths. Remind myself why I chose questions over answers, why I left seminary, why I became a ranger instead of a preacher. Because the wilderness doesn't lie to you. It doesn't promise easy solutions or eternal comfort. It just is what it is. Beautiful and terrible and completely indifferent to human suffering. And somehow, that honesty is more comforting than any sermon I ever heard. But I know he's still out there, moving from church to church, collecting souls for his congregation. And I know that someday, when I'm old and tired and running out of reasons to keep fighting, He'll call to me again. When that day comes, I hope I'm strong enough to remember why the questions matter more than the answers. I hope I remember that faith without doubt isn't faith at all. It's just surrender. And I hope someone else is out there, keeping track of the missing persons reports, watching for the pattern of abandoned churches and peaceful deaths, ready to stand guard against the kind of preacher who offers salvation at the cost of everything that makes us human. Because this isn't over. It's never over. There are too many empty churches in these mountains, and too many people looking for something to believe in. And somewhere out there, in an abandoned building where faith used to live, the preacher is preparing for tonight's service.